and thank you for joining us. And today we have an extraordinarily special guest. Bruce Gordon is here to talk to us about covering politics. And boy, is it a changing venue of covering politics. He's been doing this for many, many years, and he's going to kind of walk us through of how he got interested in politics and how things have changed from then until now. Bruce, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Tell us a little bit about kind of how you got launched in this work arena, and I think it dates back to when you were actually in high school.
Yeah, I got involved in the local, I guess not just local, in-house television news program at my high school in suburban Philadelphia in Bucks County. And it was something I've wanted to do ever since I figured out I wasn't going to be a baseball hero or a football star. I figured this was the career for me. I was probably one of the few kids, 14-year-olds back in I guess it would have been 73, 74, to be spending my afternoons watching the Watergate hearings on TV. And it just fascinated me, the whole nexus of journalism, in that case, journalism and politics. And was interested in it right from the start. I vividly remember, Nixon beating Humphrey in '68 and beating McGovern in '72, even though I would have been a rather young lad at the time. But it was just something that interested me right from the start. And when I got out of college, my second job in Austin, Texas, was really where I got involved in covering politics for the first time, covering the legislature in Texas. The governor's office and the legislature, and found it fascinating then and still do.
In off years, people don't often find like the politics kind of the sexy assignment because you have to sit through a lot of stuff that maybe isn't as interesting. But so does it kind of take a unique person with an interest in history and political science to really kind of grasp this and really want to do this?
I think so, to a certain degree. My major at Northwestern, I went to the Medill School of Journalism. My major was, of course, journalism, but my minor was American history. And to this day, I joke with my wife, she reads almost entirely fiction. I read almost exclusively nonfiction. I figure there's so much interesting stuff that's actually happened that I want to read about that. Everything I can read about that before I move on to fiction. But yeah, I mean, in the off years and the off times, there are those seemingly dull meetings to sift through, but there's always an interesting story that can be found somewhere, and you will likely start your career covering city council or some kind of local governmental body. And if you figure out the characters, the cast of characters, the elected officials, who they are, what they're about, some of the internal battles that are going on behind the scenes, there's always an interesting story to be found there. It may not seem as sexy as a presidential race, for example, but the stories are there.
Mm-hmm. And, why is it so important to really learn at not the bottom, but like at the local level? You're not going to get your first few jobs covering the governor or the president. So why is it really good to have those stepping stones at the local government level and political level?
Well, among other reasons, frankly, it's where you learn and where you make your mistakes. And you're probably better off. You're still going to get in trouble for making a mistake like you would in any line of work, but probably better off making a mistake at a small local level than on some massive national issue. You've got to learn the ropes. You've got to figure out what's important, what isn't important. You've got to work under deadline pressure like everybody else does in this business. And so you learn about these relationships, and you will find in many cases that you can take that local learning, the local government learning that you got, and place it right over top of what you're doing at the state level or the national level. There's not a big difference, frankly. It's a bigger stage, obviously, but not a big difference in terms of the interpersonal relationships, the inter- and intra-party battles that go on, the issues that are at stake, the timing when you bring legislation to the forefront and when you may want to sit on it, campaigning and all that kind of thing. A lot of that will translate from local to state to national levels. And if you understand it at the local level, there's a decent chance you'll have a good head start at the state and national level as well.
Yeah, that is really, really critical. And talk a little bit more about these relationships, which turn into sources, or, you have a good relationship with someone in the local legislature or in Washington, D.C., and you can pick up the phone and call, and guess what? They'll call you back. So can you talk a little bit about the importance of developing those like real relationships?
Yeah, I think that's important in this beat as it is in every beat, just as it is in the police beat or any other beat, is learning the key players and earning their trust. And when you talk to these folks, you've got to understand where they're coming from. Hopefully they understand where you're coming from. They need to know that you're going to treat them fairly. Doesn't mean they get as I would call it, a free commercial when you do a story, but they've got to know that you're coming at this from a place of intellectual honesty. Everybody comes at this business, at this job in terms of political reporting with their own biases, their own built-in set of opinions that they may have. You may be liberal, you may be conservative, but when you approach these folks, you've got to understand that that has to be set aside, and you've got to approach them fairly and squarely. And if you do that, they will rely on you being a professional, and you may well get some information that you need. On the other hand, you've got to ensure that you're not getting played by these folks, because that will happen left and right. I remember as a young reporter in Austin, and certainly in Austin, probably 25, 26 years old at the time. And I probably, looking back on it, did far too many stories on pieces of legislation that were being introduced by a legislator. And in retrospect, they got as close to a free commercial as they could have hoped for out of that legislation they were introducing. And the fact is, there was zero chance it was going to get passed, because I probably didn't ask enough questions about co-sponsors and the realistic hopes for getting this kind of legislation passed. And so they got to talk about this wonderful piece of legislation that was going to solve all the world's ills and made them look good on TV that night. But there was zero chance it was ever going to get passed. As we all know, hundreds and hundreds of pieces of legislation are introduced every year in all kinds of different legislative bodies. Only a handful actually get passed. And so I'm sure as a young reporter, I was a little too ready to accept that, hey, this is an interesting story about this legislation, but is there any chance it actually becomes reality? And I was probably a little wet behind the ears on some of those stories.
Yes. Well, that's all part of the learning process, which is so important. So another interesting thing, I worked in Washington for a long time and did a lot of stuff on the Hill and at the White House. And it's interesting because when you're young, do you think you can kind of become enamored with the person and the whole situation, and then maybe you're not being fair and balanced? So how, when you're young and learning how to be a political reporter, how do you not let that happen?
It is tough. It is absolutely tough not to be starstruck when you're seeing some of these folks as a young reporter who come to your town. I still remember covering Phil Gramm, who was a well-known U.S. Senator from Texas. His first Senate battle, the first time he won as the U.S. Senator coming out of Texas. And I'll never forget, I was a young reporter and I hadn't met him ever before. We had about a 2-minute conversation prior to going on the air after his victory that night. And, I told him my name, obviously. And during the live interview, he said, well, Bruce, and went on with his answer. And I thought to myself, boy, that was good. This guy is making me look good by making it sound like the 25-year-old kid reporter at the local station knows and is on a first name basis with this guy who's the new U.S. Senator from Texas. We had met 2 minutes earlier, but the implication was that we knew each other and we were on not level footing, certainly, but we were kind of both adults talking to each other, and he was going to use my first name. And I realized pretty quickly that that was just a skill that he had as a politician, but I remember being impressed by it. And it's also, I think, very true that when you talk to these folks, you may personally feel their views are absolutely abhorrent to everything you consider logical and right and ethical and moral in the world. But you will find when you talk to folks, the more you talk to them firsthand, you will find more often than not, certainly not always, but more often than not, that they come by their views at least relatively honestly. And they have these views not just as a strategy or a tactic, but they truly believe what they're saying. And so you have to respect that. And if you respect that, they will likely respect you and what you're doing. But you've got to understand that just because they disagree with your personal views doesn't make their views illegitimate.
Right. And a lot of these people are surrounded by what we call their handlers. So can you just briefly talk about, it's like you're not going to really maybe have the relationship with the senator, but maybe with their press secretary, their assistant press secretary, the administrative assistant who answers the phone. Can you just talk about the importance of building those relationships too?
Yeah, hugely important, because frankly, it's been my experience over the years, a couple of things. First of all, those folks are sort of standing off in the wings. They're not on stage as the elected official is. They're standing in the wings, and many of them like the idea of that being sort of right next to power. They don't have the power themselves per se, but they're sort of right there within earshot and arm's length of power. And they like that a lot. And they like the idea, and I think many people do, it's a function of human nature. They like the idea that they could tip you off to something and it winds up on the news that night. It gives them a feeling of power. And so to know these folks and to be in good with them is certainly helpful. They are, the more experienced they are, though, also in position to be able to kind of give you a little bit of BS here and there. Their primary job is to make their boss look good. And as long as you realize that, then you're in decent shape. But they like the power that comes with sort of being a source and telling you things, but they're also primarily looking out for their boss's best interest, not necessarily the public's right to know. So you've got to always be aware of that. There is a city official in the city of Philadelphia, where I've reported for many years, whose habit was to be lavishing praise and compliments on you before he would give you a piece of information. It was always something along the lines of, well, Bruce, I know you're too good a reporter to fall for that nonsense about such and such. And you would just get buttered up, and then would come the information that may or may not have been accurate, but you had butter dripping off you before you got to the information. And that's something you've got to look out for as well. These folks are skilled professionals. They're in these positions as assistants and communications directors for legislators and other elected officials for a reason. They're good at what they do.
Mm-hmm. And if they're calling you, maybe you have to be extra skeptical, just like, what is the motivation behind the phone call to you versus you
right.
to get them and then not calling you back?
And real quickly, and the timing is important as well. It is not a coincidence that as election time rolls near, especially when the incumbent is in a tough race for re-election, suddenly that elected official who you never saw for weeks and weeks and weeks on end is suddenly out every other week with a news conference about some issue or some piece of legislation they've suddenly got cooking. And so the timing is important too. You don't want to get played in terms of becoming part of their campaign for election or for re-election when you never heard from them for 6 months prior. So something to keep an eye on.
And I think over time, as you kind of mature as a journalist, you trust your gut, right? I mean, don't you over the years and when I would produce for you, like you just get a feeling that maybe there's an ulterior motive or there's a reason. So you just have to trust your gut and, just be cautious.
And you'd like to not be cynical, but you should be skeptical. And there's obviously a difference between the two. You'd like to be skeptical. And when you get a piece of information, you have to say to yourself, okay, is there something to the timing of this? Is there something about this that doesn't quite smell right? And you will get better at that, just like anyone gets better at their job after they've done it for a number of years.
I want to bring in our political reporter, Bruce Gordon, now to talk about a music video making the rounds. How do you top that one, Bruce?
Yeah,
I don't know.
Well, I don't know that I can. And Lauren, it's a clever attempt to stand out in a field of political candidates. John Cromer is a 63-year-old former Philly housing director who wants to become the city's sheriff so he can abolish the office and transfer its duties to other city agencies. So how do you get the point across? Well, how about channeling the 1961 Jimmy Dean classic, Big Bad John?
Did you know Philly's got a sheriff?
He's missing $50 million.
The feds are investigating. This office should be shut. That's one reason John Cromer, former Rendell housing guy, is running this May. And here's more reasons why. John Cromer, that sheriff. He'll work with the mayor to set things straight. John Cromer, that sheriff. May 17, vote Big John.
The music video is the work of Cromer's communications director and some of his talented friends from the area. They figure it costs somewhere in the $10,000 to $15,000 range to put it together. Now, Cromer is a serious candidate, but he faces an uphill fight against the perceived favorite in the Democratic primary. That would be State Representative Jewel Williams.
Always trying to set yourself apart. I assume this video is posted all over the web, right, Bruce?
It is. The idea. It's on the Cromer campaign website, on Facebook, and importantly on YouTube, where the goal here, the hope, is that folks will be drawn to watch this amusing video And then notice lots of other video postings from Cromer on serious issues related to the Sheriff's Department. As always, you grab people with the ice cream sundae and then you feed them the vegetables once they get there.
Right, and we always know, we've known recently that the internet really is the place to be for politicians right now.
It sure is, yeah.
All right, Bruce, that was interesting. Cool, thanks, bye.
Right. So I'm just thinking back on some fun elections that I've produced for you. I remember the sunrise over the Capitol, the day Obama was going to be sworn in the first time. Then we're at National Stadium. There's always technical problems. I think we were with Tom Beck. There was some kind of technical camera problem at National
There
Stadium.
always are.
There's always some kind of like problem. So talk about just like being able to like talk on your feet. Like you are just so smooth. And, you know, I remember us getting a countdown and they're about to cue us and like, there you are. And you are just smooth as ever. And how do you develop that? And how do you work on that skill to really be able to think and talk on your feet?
It's funny, and I appreciate the kind words. I think I did my first national political convention in 1984, so I would have been 25 years old. That was the Democratic convention in San Francisco. And again, talk about being gullible. I came out of that having never covered a convention before, thinking, wow, these folks are really jazzed up. They're really ready to rock and roll here. This could be a really good race. Well, of course, the 1984 Reagan re-election was an absolute landslide. It was a demolition of the Democratic Party. So it shows what I knew. But look, it's the same as with anything else in this business. If you are fully prepared, then you're ready for anything. I've often said, after all these years that I did this and did this for 40 plus years, if I wasn't sure about the material that I had, if I wasn't really sure I knew my stuff, I was still nervous about doing a 1-minute hit on the air. But if I felt like I knew my material, and someone said, we need you to go live for the next 45 minutes straight with an anchor, maybe asking you some questions, I didn't feel remotely ill at ease about those scenarios because I had done my homework and I knew the research and I was ready for almost any question that could be asked. And I find it infinitely and endlessly interesting. And so I could talk about it forever until they finally yanked the mic out of my hand.
And that leads to my next question about preparation. We've all seen reporters and anchors who don't cover politics regularly. They're thrown in to some live shot on election night and they don't know what they're doing. And it like is not great.
And
so,
it shows immediately. And that's the sad part.
Immediately. And so, you know, how do you prepare? And it's not like you only start preparing a day or a week before, like it's months and years. And so how do you prepare for an election night, whether it be a mayor or Hillary Clinton? You know, at the Bellevue that night, and she's going to have an acceptance speech.
One word: read. And it's not all that much more complicated than that. I do political analysis now for my old TV station, and I do that once or twice each week. And you know, you're on the air for 4 minutes, but there's 4 hours or 40 hours of reading that goes into every time you're on the air. The nice thing about things over time, it has gotten exponentially easier to do your research. And there are great websites out there. In addition to the newspaper websites that I read every day, I'm constantly on sites like Politico. I find realclearpolitics.com to be a great site. In part, it's an aggregator site. In other words, basically it is different columns and so forth being taken from different sites and put on their site. It's not original reporting, but what you're getting from a site like that is a far left view and a far right view, and somebody who's in between. You're getting a variety of viewpoints and you're learning some things you might not have thought about had you not seen that column. But you've got to just read. You've got to do your homework and you've got to know exactly what's going on. I'm a history buff, and so I find this kind of stuff interesting. We're talking now about the possibility of, if the Democrats take control of the White House and the Senate, would they try and pack the US Supreme Court? So I've been doing a lot of reading about that. When was the last time it was tried? How, you know, what level of success was there? Short answer, none. But you need to know the history of these things. And if you know the history, then you're in position to talk about it intelligently. And the viewer knows when you don't know. The viewer knows when your question is to the newly elected official, so what's your reaction, or what do you think? And one of these kind of wide open, vague questions. And frankly, it's insulting to the person who's just been elected or who's in the news that night, because they know you haven't taken the time to prep yourself, to do your homework. And the likelihood is that they're not going to be so receptive the next time you come looking for an interview, because they don't want to waste their time. No one does.
All right, quickly, we're running out of time. This has changed a lot. What is it like? And I know you could talk about this for a long time. Like, what the current landscape, like how is covering politics so different now?
It is very challenging these days. And I saw this happening and getting worse and worse over the last number of years that I was at my station. And that is, people come into all of these events with a preconceived notion, and they specifically come into a preconceived notion about you as a reporter. I don't know that there's much you can do about that. At the time, at the scene, I worked for the Fox station in Philadelphia for many years. I would arrive at a Republican event and they would practically carry me on their shoulders to my camera position. I would show up at a Democratic event with the Fox logo and there'd be people booing and hissing. Now, in both cases, they didn't really know much about me or my reporting, that was clear, but they had made up their minds based on the logo on the microphone. It's gotten more and more that way. It is an incredibly polarized time, and so your job becomes much more difficult because you are going to be called out in some cases, as we've seen from President Trump, who's made no secret of his concerns about the media and media coverage. You're going to get called out from the stage, you're going to get called out from the crowd, and it can be tough, it can be challenging. And I don't doubt that on occasion, you're going to want to lash back or rebut some of this, but you've got a job to do. And so your best bet is to keep quiet, keep your nose to the wheel, and do the best job you can. But there are people who will make up their mind about you before ever seeing anything you've reported. And there's not much you can do about that in these polarized times, sadly.
All right, finally, some advice for these high school and college students, mainly college students who are watching this, advice for these budding young journalists who think they want to take the political route.
I think this is some of the most important reporting that you can do, and it's incredibly valuable if you do it well. And so you've got to read, you've got to be immersed in this kind of material, you've got to understand the background and the context. Nothing happens in a vacuum in these political environments. There's always a backstory to it. What's just happening now with the Supreme Court situation has a backstory of 2016 and frankly prior to that. So you've got to do your reading, you've got to do your homework, you've got to be fully immersed in it, and frankly, you've got to believe in the importance of what you're doing. This is important stuff that you're talking about. This is not little light features and so forth, all of which have their place in the newscast, but this is important stuff, informing people and giving them the information they need when they want to go out and vote or decide to support this candidate or oppose another candidate. They've got to have the information at their hands, and you're one of the people supplying that information. So it's a great responsibility. You don't want to take yourself too seriously, but you better take what you do real seriously.
Well, a wonderful, fulfilling career. I mean, you wouldn't have changed anything.
No. It's been a heck of a ride, but wouldn't have changed a thing about it. Yeah.
All right. Well, Bruce Gordon, he is among the best of the best in the country. A great political reporter, always fair, works so hard. And it's just been a pleasure to talk with you today. And you can tell by the 10 Emmy Awards behind him that he is just
how do those get there?
Top notch in the field. Bruce, thank you so much. We appreciate your time and good luck this fall.
Courtney, always my pleasure to chat with you.